Commander Zira Velkai, a young Solani explorer, stared out at the rocky landscape of Vorthis 7. Her ship, the Skylark, had been damaged during an attack by the ruthless Ralzek warlords. The wreckage lay scattered across the harsh planet's surface like a broken puzzle. She had barely survived the crash, and the weeks that followed had tested every ounce of her survival skills. The thought of being alone on this world, so far from any hope of rescue, gnawed at her. Vorthis 7 was not a place for the faint-hearted. It was a death world, a planet with high gravity, violent storms, and predators that seemed to exist just to kill. The environment itself was hostile. The trees were thick with thorny vines, the air was thin and difficult to breathe, and the ground trembled beneath her feet as if the planet itself wanted to shake her off. Zira had been trained for situations like this. As a commander in the Solani Space Force, she had undergone years of survival training. She knew how to make fire from almost nothing, how to purify water from even the most toxic sources, and how to use basic weapons. But nothing could have prepared her for the crushing loneliness that settled in her heart after the crash. The silence of the barren landscape echoed in her ears, and the only company she had were the distant sounds of storms and the occasional growl of a predator somewhere in the wilderness. As the days passed, Zira fought to stay alive. She carefully rationed her remaining supplies, hunting small creatures for food and using her skills to set traps for larger ones. But the constant feeling of isolation was a weight she could hardly bear. She thought about her crew, her family, and the world she had left behind. She often wondered if anyone would even come looking for her. Were they even searching, or had they assumed she was lost forever? Her mind wandered back to the moment of the crash. The Skylark had been hit by a burst of enemy fire, and everything had gone dark. When she woke up, the ship was burning, and the ground was closing in around her. She remembered the sickening sound of metal tearing apart, the blinding light of the explosion, and the feeling of being thrown through the air. It was a miracle she had survived, and now, it seemed, she was the last one left. But then something caught her eye. A footprint, not her own. It was small, but unmistakable, pressed into the dirt near the wreckage. Zira froze, her heart racing. She had spent days carefully scanning the area for any signs of life, and for the first time, she saw evidence that she wasn't completely alone. She crouched down, examining the footprint carefully. It was too fresh to be from an animal, and too large to be from a smaller creature. It was humanoid. Her first thought was that she had stumbled upon a fellow survivor from another ship that had crashed on this world. Her second thought was that it might be a trick, a lure from the enemy. The Ralzek warlords were notorious for using deception and setting traps for their prey. Zira didn't hesitate. She had been trained to think on her feet, and this was no time to be cautious. If someone else was out here, they could be a friend or an enemy, but she couldn't afford to assume anything. Slowly and silently, she began following the trail, keeping to the shadows and watching her surroundings with a sharp eye. The jungle seemed to close in around her, the sounds of distant creatures making her nerves jump. As she moved deeper into the rocky terrain, she spotted more tracks. These were definitely not the clumsy footprints of an animal. They were human-sized. Zira felt a mix of relief and dread. Whoever had left these marks might have the answers she was looking for, but they could also be dangerous, especially if they were part of a Ralzek hunting party. She moved cautiously, her senses heightened. Each step brought her closer to the unknown figure. Her pulse quickened as the trail led her through dense brush and jagged rock formations. The planet's storms began to pick up again, dark clouds gathering overhead as lightning crackled across the sky. Zira knew she didn't have much time before the storm would make it impossible to see anything. She pushed forward, desperate to find whoever had left the footprints. Then, just as she rounded a corner, she saw him. A figure, standing tall against the backdrop of the storm, staring straight at her. His clothes were torn and patched with what looked like scraps of metal and fabric, and his posture was relaxed but ready. He looked like he had been here for a long time, just like her. The man's voice broke the silence. "You can come out now. I know you're there." Zira hesitated. She wasn't sure if she should trust him, but something in his voice told her that he wasn't a threat. After all, if he had wanted to hurt her, he could have ambushed her by now. Slowly, Zira stepped forward, her hand still on her weapon, ready for anything. But what she found surprised her. A human. Zira stepped into the clearing, eyes fixed on the figure who had so calmly spoken to her. He was standing just a few meters away, a human, tall and rugged. His face was weathered, with dark stubble covering his jaw, and his expression was serious but not unfriendly. His clothes were a mix of salvaged pieces, patchwork armor made from metal scraps, worn-out fabric, and bits of equipment that looked like they'd seen better days. He didn't seem surprised to see her, and there was a calmness to his presence that made Zira's guard drop just a little. She had expected to find either a dangerous hunter or perhaps another stranded survivor. But what stood before her was something different, a human deathworlder. Zira wasn't sure what to make of him. She had heard stories of humans, how they were able to survive in even the harshest conditions, how they could adapt to anything, even the most unforgiving planets. But she'd never imagined she would meet one herself. The galaxy called them Deathworlders because of their ability to thrive on planets like Vorthis 7, worlds where no one else could survive. But this one looked like he had been living here for a long time, and he didn't seem worried about anything. The man didn't move, but his eyes studied her carefully, scanning her for any sign of aggression. Zira, still cautious, lowered her weapon slightly but didn't let her guard slip entirely. "I knew you were there," he said again, his voice deep and steady. "You didn't make much noise. You're a good tracker." Zira narrowed her eyes at him. "Who are you?" The man's lips twitched into a faint smile. "Name's Elias Voss. You're on Vorthis 7, the worst place in this sector to get stranded. And you've got about a day before that storm catches up with us. Not sure where you came from, but I've seen your ship out there." Zira was taken aback. He had seen her ship. "You've been here longer than I thought." Elias nodded. "More than a year. Came down in a battle." Skylark didn't exactly have a smooth landing. He raised an eyebrow at the wreckage. "I'll be honest, I thought no one was left alive after that fight. And yet, here you are." Zira was stunned. The year? This man had been alone on this death world for over a year, surviving in its brutal conditions. Her thoughts raced. How had he survived? How was he still alive? "You've been here for a year?" she asked, still trying to process his words. He shrugged as if it was no big deal. "You get used to it. There's a lot of things on this planet that'll kill you if you're not careful, but there's also a lot of things that can be used. You learn how to make what you need out of nothing. I've got traps set for food, a shelter that holds up against the storms, and a basic way to purify water. It's not pretty, but it works." Zira was impressed. "You've been surviving like this all alone." He nodded. "Guess I'm not alone anymore, though. I've never met anyone else down here." He glanced at her. "You're not with the Ralzek, are you?" Zira stiffened. The Ralzek warlords had been the ones who had attacked her ship, but Elias didn't seem worried. She could sense the quiet strength in him, a man who had endured so much, but remained unbroken. "No," she said carefully. "I'm not with the Ralzek. I'm Selani. My ship was attacked, and I've been trying to survive ever since." Elias looked her up and down, and for a moment, there was silence between them. He seemed to be considering something, weighing her response. "Well, you don't look like you're in too bad shape. You've got the look of a survivor." He extended a hand to her. "So, you've got a name." Zira hesitated for a moment, then took his hand. "Zira Velkai, commander of the Skylark. I thought I was the only one left." Elias's expression softened just a bit. "I get it. You're not the only one, though. You're just the first one I've seen in a while." Zira felt a rush of relief, But the thought of being so close to another living being made her cautious again. "So, what now?" she asked. Elias tilted his head, glancing at the thickening clouds overhead. "Well, that storm's gonna hit soon, and we don't want to be caught in it. I've got a shelter nearby where we can ride it out. After that, we'll need to figure out what to do next. The storm's bad, but I've learned to work with the planet instead of against it." He turned to walk in the direction of his shelter, but then stopped and looked back at her. "You coming?" Zira took a deep breath. She had thought she was alone on this desolate world, but now she wasn't so sure. She could see in his eyes that he was telling the truth. He had survived longer than anyone should have on a world like this. Maybe together, they could find a way off. With a single nod, Zira followed him, her mind racing with questions about this mysterious human and the strange bond that was forming between them. Zira followed Elias through the dense jungle, her steps careful but steady. The wind began to pick up, and the sky darkened as thick clouds rolled in from the horizon. She had only been on Vorthis 7 for a few weeks, and every storm still felt like a new challenge. But with Elias leading the way, she felt a strange sense of hope. He seemed to know the planet better than anyone, like he had become part of it. As they walked, Elias spoke casually, explaining the little details of survival on Vorthis 7. "This planet's got its own rhythm," he said, glancing up at the swirling clouds above. "You get used to it. You learn when the storms are coming and how to avoid the worst of it. You keep moving, and the planet doesn't have the same power over you." Zira listened closely. There was a calm confidence in Elias that made her trust him. She had seen countless survivors on other worlds, but none had adapted to such an unforgiving place like he had. "How long did it take you to get used to all of this?" Zira asked, glancing at the strange, twisted trees around them. Some of them looked like they had been burned by lightning, while others had vines hanging from their branches, dripping with thick sap. Elias grinned, a faraway look in his eyes. "It took a while. At first, I thought I was going to die. Every day felt like a fight just to stay alive. The storms, the wildlife, even the food, it was all trying to kill me. But you learn, right? You adapt. And once you do, it's not so bad." They reached a small clearing, and Elias pointed toward a collection of rocks arranged in a circle. It was a simple structure, but it looked solid. "This is my shelter," he said, walking over to the rocks and pulling aside a tarpaulin cover that had been set up as a makeshift roof. "You'll be safe here while the storm passes." Zira stepped inside the shelter, grateful for the cover. The winds outside were picking up, and the first crack of thunder echoed through the air. She felt a chill run down her spine, not from the cold, but from the realization that, for the first time, she was not alone on this deadly world. Elias stepped inside after her, taking off his heavy pack and setting it down in the corner. "I've got some food and water here, but it's all basic stuff," he said, pulling out a small bag of dried meat and a container of purified water. "I know it's not much, but it'll get us through the storm." Zira took the food gratefully, though she could tell it had been prepared in the most basic way possible. It wasn't fancy, but in this situation, it was a small luxury. As they sat in the shelter, the storm outside grew fiercer. The winds howled, and rain lashed against the tarpaulin. But inside the small circle of rocks, it was quiet. Zira realized how much she had missed the sound of another voice. "So, you've been here for over a year?" Zira asked, her curiosity getting the better of her. "How did you survive for so long?" Elias looked thoughtful for a moment before answering. "It wasn't easy at first. The first few months were the hardest. I didn't know what I was doing. I was just trying to stay alive. But then, I started to figure out the rhythm of the planet, the way the animals move, the way the storms work. I learned how to set traps for food, how to find shelter from the worst of the weather. But most importantly, I learned how to keep my head together. You've got to keep your mind sharp, or you'll go mad out here." Zira nodded, understanding. She had seen it before. It was easy to lose hope, to feel like the world was against you. But Elias had done the impossible. He had not only survived, but he had thrived. "Have you tried to contact anyone?" she asked, her voice low. Elias shook his head. "The planet messes with communication. I tried a few times, but the signal's too weak. The storms, the terrain, it all blocks any signals. I thought about trying to fix one of the ships, but without proper tools, it wasn't worth the risk. For now, the only thing that matters is staying alive. Once you do that, everything else is secondary." Zira felt a strange sense of admiration for him. He had resigned himself to the fact that there was no immediate rescue. He had become a part of the planet, living with it, rather than against it. It was something she had never truly understood until now. She had always believed in a quick solution, in being rescued or found. But Elias? He had made peace with the harsh reality. The wind outside howled again, shaking the shelter's tarpaulin. Zira shivered slightly, but it wasn't from the cold. The storm, the isolation, it had brought something out in her. She didn't feel alone anymore. "Do you ever regret it?" Zira asked, her voice quiet. "Staying here, I mean." Elias looked at her, his expression soft but serious. "No, I don't regret it. I made peace with it. Out here, you can't afford to regret anything. You just keep going. That's all you can do." Zira thought about his words for a moment. She didn't regret it either. For the first time since the crash, she felt like maybe, just maybe, they could make it out of here. Together. The storm raged outside, but inside the small shelter, Zira and Elias had settled into a quiet rhythm. The wind howled, and the rain battered the tarpaulin roof, but it was oddly peaceful within the circle of rocks. Zira had never felt so far from everything she knew, yet in some strange way, this small shelter with Elias made the vast, deadly world of Vorthis 7 feel a little less overwhelming. Zira sat quietly, her eyes occasionally flicking to the dim glow of the small fire Elias had started in the corner. The flames flickered and crackled, casting dancing shadows on the walls of the shelter. It was the only warmth they had, but it was enough for now. Elias sat across from her, his eyes steady but thoughtful. "You know, I've been thinking," Elias said suddenly, breaking the silence. "This isn't all we've got. We're not stuck here forever." Zira raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "What do you mean?" Elias leaned forward slightly, his eyes glinting with determination. "I've been surviving here for a long time, and while this planet isn't exactly welcoming, it's got one thing going for it: resources. I've been making do with what's here, but there are ships out there, ships that could get us off this rock. We just need to fix one up." Zira's heart skipped a beat. Fix a ship. It sounded like an impossible task, but Elias had survived a year on this planet alone. If anyone knew how to make something work, it was him. But still, she couldn't help but ask, "How are we going to fix a ship? I don't even know where to begin." Elias smiled, as if he had been expecting the question. "I've got a few ideas," he said, "and some tools. It won't be easy, but it's possible. The wreckage of the ships out there has enough parts for us to work with. We just need to find the right one." Zira stared at him, still trying to grasp the plan. It sounded like a long shot, but then again, they had been stuck in worse situations before. "All right," she said finally, "but where do we start?" Elias sat back and rubbed his chin thoughtfully. "First, we'll need to find a way to scout the wreckage. The storm's not going to give us much of a break, but we can't waste too much time. Once we get there, we'll have to be quick. Some of the ships are still dangerous, unstable, even. They might have Relzek traps or other threats." Zira nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. The Relzek were dangerous, but Elias seemed so calm and collected, like he was ready for whatever was to come. "How long do you think it will take?" she asked. Elias paused for a moment, considering. "A few days, maybe longer, depending on the wreckage we find. But I'm not going to lie to you. It's risky. There's no guarantee the ship's systems will even be salvageable. Zira's fingers curled into fists as she absorbed his words. A few days. Risky. Uncertain. They would need to be smart and move carefully. But the thought of escaping this planet, of seeing the stars again, pushed away the fear creeping into her mind. "We'll have to get a lot of things ready," Zira said, determination settling in her chest. "Food, water, and a plan to protect ourselves if we run into trouble." Elias chuckled softly. "Sounds like you've done this before. You're right, though. We'll need supplies. I've got a few traps set up nearby, but I'll need to check them. In the meantime, we should prepare as much as we can." They spent the rest of the evening working together, gathering their gear and making a plan. Elias showed her how to reset some of the traps he had set around the area for small animals, and Zira helped him prepare their supplies. She felt an odd sense of camaraderie building between them, a silent agreement that they were in this together. They had a shared goal now, getting off Vorthis 7. As they finished preparing, Elias gave her a small, wry smile. "You know, I've never met anyone like you. I've been out here for a long time, and it's always been just me and the planet. But you're different. You're strong. You're focused." Zira felt her cheeks flush, but she shrugged it off. "I don't know about that. I'm just trying to survive." Elias's smile widened. "That's more than enough." Later that night, as they lay beneath the stars, Zira stared up at the sky. It was still dark and stormy, but the promise of a way off this planet seemed to linger in the air. The stars felt a little closer now, and the idea of escaping Vorthis 7 didn't seem as impossible as it had before. She knew the next few days would be difficult. There were no guarantees, but with Elias by her side, she finally felt like she wasn't alone. Together, they might just make it off this death world. And maybe, just maybe, they'd find a way to return to their own people, alive and whole. "Tomorrow, we go," Elias said, as if reading her thoughts. "Get some rest. We got a long journey ahead." Zira closed her eyes, allowing herself a moment of peace before the real work began. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time since the crash, she felt like they had a chance. A real chance. The storm had passed by the time they set out, leaving behind a heavy, humid air that clung to everything. The sky had cleared, revealing the harsh landscape of Vorthis 7 in all its brutal beauty. Zira wiped the sweat from her forehead as she followed Elias, her boots sinking slightly into the damp ground. They had packed only the essentials, food, water, and basic tools, and set out towards the wreckage. Elias moved ahead, his steps sure and steady, as though he had walked this path 1,000 times. Zira struggled to keep up, but she was determined. The thought of finding a way off this planet pushed her forward, even as the dense jungle around them seemed to close in. The towering trees and thick vines were relentless, making it hard to see far ahead. But Elias seemed to know exactly where to go, as if the planet itself had become a part of him. "You all right back there?" Elias called over his shoulder. Zira nodded. "Yeah, just keeping up." Her voice was steady, but she knew that this journey wasn't going to be easy. She had seen enough of the planet to know that even the smallest misstep could lead to disaster. Elias glanced back with a half-smile. "Don't worry, you'll get used to it. Just follow my lead, and we'll be fine." Zira's mind raced. What if they weren't fine? What if the wreckage was too far gone to repair? What if they couldn't get the ship running again? She pushed those thoughts aside. Focus on what you can control. They continued on, the jungle growing thicker as they moved deeper into the wilderness. The sounds of distant creatures echoed through the trees, and Zira's senses were on high alert. Vorthis 7 was home to deadly creatures, large predators, venomous insects, and more. They would need to stay sharp. After a few hours of trudging through the thick underbrush, Elias suddenly stopped. He raised a hand to signal Zira to halt, his eyes scanning the surroundings. Zira's heart skipped a beat as she froze, instinctively reaching for her weapon. She wasn't sure what he had seen, but she trusted his judgment. "What's wrong?" Zira whispered. Elias didn't answer immediately. He crouched down, his eyes trained on the ground. Slowly, he pointed at a series of footprints, large, deep impressions in the soft mud. Zira crouched beside him, studying the tracks. "What are these?" she asked, her voice low. Elias frowned. "These belong to a Vorthian predator, not something you want to mess with." His voice was calm, but Zira could see the tension in his posture. She swallowed hard. Vorthian predators were known for their speed and strength. They were capable of taking down creatures much larger than themselves, and humans like Elias were no exception. "Are we in danger?" Zira asked, her heart racing. Elias stood up, motioning for her to follow him. "No, if we're careful, we should be fine. These creatures are territorial, and they usually avoid larger groups. We just need to stay out of sight." They moved carefully, using the thick foliage as cover. Zira's every instinct was on edge as they made their way through the jungle. She couldn't stop thinking about the predator's tracks. What if they crossed paths with one of them? The thought made her pulse quicken. After what felt like an eternity, Elias finally stopped again, holding up a hand. Zira caught her breath, expecting more danger. But this time, Elias pointed ahead. "There it is," he said softly. In the distance, through a break in the trees, Zira could just make out the silhouette of a large ship, one of the wrecks they had been searching for. It was battered, its hull scarred by flames and impact, but it was still recognizable as a ship. A chance. Her heart skipped a beat. "We've got to be careful now," Elias said, his voice low. "This ship might be unstable, and we don't know what's inside. Stay close." Zira nodded, her focus sharpening. She had been preparing for this moment since she had met Elias. The wreckage had to hold the answers to their escape. As they approached the ship, Zira felt a growing sense of hope, but it was mixed with caution. The closer they got, the more the wreckage seemed to loom over them like a giant, broken monument to the dangers of Vorthis 7. The hull was blackened, twisted by fire and impact, and parts of it had collapsed inward, forming a jagged, dangerous outline. Elias moved first, carefully circling the wreck, inspecting it for any signs of danger. Zira followed him, keeping a careful distance. She could see the ship's entry hatch in the distance, but it was partially blocked by debris. They would have to find another way in. "We're going to need to get inside," Elias muttered to himself, scanning the area. "There's got to be a way." Zira glanced around. The wreckage had left the ground uneven, with scattered metal debris and broken parts everywhere. If they weren't careful, they could easily trigger something dangerous. Elias motioned for her to follow him as he moved toward the rear of the ship, his eyes alert for any signs of life or movement. Zira's heart beat faster as they neared the ship, the weight of their plan settling heavily on her shoulders. This was it, their chance. With one final glance at the twisted remains of the ship, Zira followed Elias toward the rear hatch, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The wrecked ship loomed ahead, its twisted metal and scorched hull standing like a monument to the chaos of Vorthis 7. The closer Zira and Elias got, the more they could see the damage. Chunks of metal had been torn away, leaving gaping holes that revealed the ship's broken interior. Some sections of the ship had completely caved in, while others looked like they were barely holding together. It was a miracle it was still standing. Zira's heart pounded as they approached the rear hatch. The air around them was thick with tension. Every step felt like it brought them closer to their goal, and also to potential danger. The ship might have been abandoned, but Vorthis 7 had a way of turning even the safest places into threats. Every shadow, every rustling sound, had her on edge. Elias crouched beside the hatch, examining the control panel. His fingers moved over the buttons and switches with practiced ease, muttering to himself as he worked. Zira stood a few paces behind, her eyes scanning the area for anything that could go wrong. "Got it," Elias said after a few moments. The hatch door slid open with a loud, protesting creak. Inside, the dark corridors of the wrecked ship stretched before them, cold and silent. The smell of burned metal and decay hit Zira's nose, but she pushed it aside. This was their only chance. Elias motioned for Zira to follow, his voice barely above a whisper. "Stay close. We don't know what's in here, and I'm not taking any chances." Zira nodded, gripping her weapon tightly as they stepped inside. The air inside the ship was stale and musty, as if the wreckage had been sitting untouched for years. The faint sounds of their footsteps echoed through the darkened hallways as they moved deeper into the ship. The walls were scorched, and some areas had collapsed under the weight of the ship's crash landing. Sparks occasionally flared from exposed wiring, and bits of debris crunched underfoot. But Elias seemed unfazed, moving carefully but quickly through the wreckage. "Watch your step," he said, his voice low and steady. "There's no telling what's still intact." Zira glanced around, her senses on high alert. She had no idea what kind of threats this ship might still hold: traps, damaged systems, or even hostile creatures that had found refuge here. Vorthis 7 wasn't a forgiving world, and neither was the wreckage of this ship. They moved through the corridors, following Elias as he led the way. The ship was eerily quiet, except for the distant hum of broken machines and the occasional snap of loose wiring. Zira felt the weight of their situation pressing down on her. They had to find something valuable here, something they could use to get off this planet. There was no turning back now. They reached what was left of the ship's control room. The door had been blasted open, and the once advanced technology inside was now a jumble of shattered screens and damaged equipment. It was clear that whatever had caused the crash had been violent. Sparks still crackled from the control panels, and the air smelled of burnt electronics. Elias crouched beside a console, his fingers dancing over the buttons. "This is the heart of it," he murmured, scanning the wreckage for anything useful. "If there's anything left, it's here." Zira stepped closer, looking over his shoulder at the mess of wires and broken equipment. She could see the faint outlines of the ship's navigation system, but it was too damaged to make sense of. If they were going to fix anything, they'd need a miracle. "What now?" Zira asked, her voice tense. The longer they stayed in the wreck, the more she felt like they were just delaying the inevitable. The ship was broken, too broken to fix, probably. They were wasting precious time. Elias didn't answer immediately. His fingers continued to work on the damaged control panel, and Zira could see the frustration on his face. He was doing his best, but the task ahead seemed impossible. Then suddenly, a low hum began to fill the room. The faintest flicker of lights came on, followed by a soft peep. Elias straightened, his eyes lighting up. "Wait," he said, almost in disbelief. "It's working. Something's working." Zira's pulse quickened. Was it the power core? Had they actually found something salvageable? Elias muttered under his breath, his fingers quickly inputting commands on the console. The humming grew louder, and slowly, a map appeared on one of the still functional screens. It was faint, but it showed the layout of the ship and a few systems still operational. The ship wasn't completely dead after all. "There's a secondary communication system on this ship," Elias said, his voice growing more excited. "It's not perfect, but we might be able to send a distress signal." Zira couldn't believe it. This was it. Their chance. "We just need to get to the communications room," Elias continued, his expression now serious. "We can send a signal there, but we have to move quickly. The systems might not last long." Zira didn't hesitate. "Lead the way." They moved swiftly through the ship's remaining corridors, their hope growing with each step. The idea of reaching out for help, the idea of leaving this planet, felt real now. It was no longer a distant dream. They had a plan. They had a way forward. But Zira knew they couldn't let their guard down. The wreckage was still dangerous, and there was no telling what might happen next. As they neared the communications room, Zira's eyes never left Elias, her mind racing with what came next. They were so close, So close to escaping this nightmare world. The communications room was located deeper inside the wreckage, and as Zira and Elias navigated through the broken ship, the air grew colder. The quiet hum of the still-functioning systems made the silence even more intense. It felt like the entire ship was holding its breath, as if waiting for something to happen. Elias led the way, moving with purpose but also with caution. Zira's heart raced in anticipation. Every step they took toward the communications room felt like it carried them closer to their goal, but it also carried them closer to more danger. The ship was old and unstable, and there was no telling when it might give way completely. They passed through a narrow corridor, the walls covered in scorch marks from the crash. The faint smell of burnt metal still lingered, but it didn't bother Zira anymore. She was focused on one thing: the chance to leave this deadly planet. Elias stopped in front of a thick metal door. A control panel beside it flickered weakly, and the door's edges were bent from the crash. Elias crouched beside the panel and began working, his fingers moving quickly but with careful precision. Zira stood back, scanning the area for any signs of trouble. "Almost there," Elias muttered, his brow furrowed in concentration. Zira felt the weight of the moment settling on her. This could be their only chance. The thought of getting off Vorthis 7, of seeing the stars again, filled her with both hope and anxiety. It had been so long since she had seen the vastness of space, and the idea of leaving this world behind seemed almost too good to be true. The door finally creaked open, revealing the communications room. It was small and cramped, filled with broken equipment and scattered debris. Some of the panels were cracked or short-circuited, but the central control station was still intact, sitting in the middle of the room like a lifeline. Elias moved toward the control panel, his eyes scanning the system. Zira followed closely, her pulse quickening. Elias sat at the console and began typing commands, his fingers moving with practiced speed. Zira glanced over his shoulder, watching him work. "Is it going to be enough?" she asked quietly. "Can we really send a signal?" Elias didn't answer right away, his focus entirely on the screen. The hum of the machinery was louder now, and a few lights flickered on, showing signs of life in the otherwise broken equipment. Finally, Elias looked up at her, a faint smile on his lips. "It's not perfect," he said, his voice steady, "but we got a chance. The ship has an old emergency beacon system. It's not much, but it might be enough to reach a passing ship or station." Zira felt a spark of hope. "Then let's do it." With a few more quick commands, Elias activated the system. The lights on the console blinked, and a soft, pulsing signal began to emit from the antenna on the ceiling. Elias leaned back, watching the signal's progress. Zira couldn't believe it. The signal was out there, reaching for help. They were no longer completely alone on Vorthis 7. But then, something strange happened. The signal suddenly flickered, and the lights on the console dimmed for a brief moment. Elias's fingers flew across the panel, his expression growing more serious. "What is it?" Zira asked, stepping closer. Her heart skipped a beat. Were they about to lose their chance? "I'm not sure," Elias said, his voice tight. "The system's old. It might be picking up interference, or maybe it's just too weak." He kept typing, trying to stabilize the signal. Zira watched him, trying to ignore the creeping feeling of dread. The last thing they needed was for the signal to fail now. Suddenly, there was a loud beep, and the console flashed green. Elias's eyes widened in surprise. "It's connecting," he said in disbelief. Zira couldn't help herself. A smile broke across her face. They had done it. They had sent the signal. Elias stood up from the console, shaking his head in awe. "I can't believe it. It's working." He turned to Zira, his eyes bright with excitement. "Now we wait." Zira took a deep breath, feeling the weight of their journey begin to lift. They had made it. They had found a way to reach out, to send a message. Now, all they could do was hope that someone, anyone, was listening. As they stood there, waiting for the signal to be picked up, Zira allowed herself a moment of peace. It had been so long since she had allowed herself to hope. Vorthis 7 had been a prison, a harsh, unforgiving world, but now there was a way out. They sat down, side by side, as the hum of the ship's systems filled the room. It was quiet, almost peaceful, except for the distant beeps from the communication system. Zira glanced at Elias, her eyes filled with gratitude. "We did it," she said softly. Elias smiled. "We did." And for the first time since the crash, Zira allowed herself to believe it. They had survived. They had found a way to escape this death world. Now all they had to do was wait for help to come, for someone to hear their call. And then, finally, they would be free.